The morning Carolyn Voss took over as regional director of Northern Passage Medical Supply, she found a man asleep at the receiving dock desk, not drowsing with his chin up the way people do when they're pretending to be awake. Actually asleep, forehead resting on his crossed arms, a half-eaten granola bar beside his keyboard, his Havis vest still zipped to the throat. She did not ask anyone who he was. She did not look at the shift log beside his hand, which would have told her he had clocked in 51 hours earlier. She looked at the name on his badge, said at once to the floor supervisor standing behind her, and told him to process the termination before lunch. Neil Chambers had not heard her come in. He had been running on almost nothing for 2 days, and the particular sleep that finally took him at a government-issue desk in a Winnipeg distribution facility was not the sleep of a man who had stopped caring. It was the sleep of a man who had held on as long as the body allowed and then surrendered without choosing to. He was 43 years old. He had worked for Northern Passage Medical Supply for 11 years, long enough to have seen 3 different ownership changes, 2 warehouse relocations, and a complete overhaul of the logistics software that had never quite worked the way anyone hoped. His title was Senior Logistics Coordinator, which sounded administrative and meant something closer to structural. He was the person who understood why the system behaved the way it did, what its tolerances were, where the old routing logic still ran underneath the new interface like a current beneath ice. New hires assumed he was simply the person who had been around too long to change. The people who had worked beside him for years understood something different entirely. Northern Passage distributed medical supplies to hospitals, long-term care facilities, and remote nursing stations across Manitoba, northwestern Ontario, and parts of the territories. The supply chain was not complicated in theory and was extremely complicated in practice. Seasonal road closures, unpredictable air freight delays, the particular fragility of cold-chain pharmaceuticals, and the reality that many of their delivery endpoints had no alternative supplier meant that a failure in their system was not a business inconvenience. It was the kind of failure that left a nursing station in a fly-in community without insulin. It was the kind of failure that had a name attached to it afterward. Neil Chambers knew this. He had internalized it over 11 years in the way that people who work in proximity to real stakes eventually do. It was not anxiety, it was a form of constant, quiet attention. Outside of work, his life had a shape that was simple and that he had built with deliberate care. His son Eli was 9 years old, dark-haired, serious-faced, with an intensity when reading that sometimes made Neil feel he was watching someone much older. Eli's mother had left when Eli was 3, and the departure had not been dramatic or hostile, only the honest conclusion of 2 people who had discovered too late that they wanted genuinely different lives. Since then, Neil had raised Eli in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city, near enough to Eli's school that they could walk on the mornings that weren't too cold, which in Winnipeg meant roughly 4 months of the year. He did not talk about Eli at work, not because he was guarded about it, but because the subject did not tend to come up in the natural course of his days, and Neil was not the kind of man who reached for personal information as a way to make himself more visible. He showed up. He knew the job. He went home. Carolyn Voss had arrived at Northern Passage from a career in procurement management in the private sector, most recently with a national pharmacy chain that had never, to her knowledge, failed to deliver a shipment simply because a dirt road had become impassable. She was 36, precise, and genuinely competent in the areas she had been trained for. She had been brought in by the new parent company with a clear mandate: tighten operations, reduce redundancy, build a culture of documented accountability. The regional director who preceded her had run things on institutional memory and personal relationships, and the parent company wanted processes. Her first week had been a series of meetings she found largely unproductive, and one observation that kept returning to her: almost nothing in this operation was written down. Procedures existed in people's heads. Contingency routes were known by specific individuals and nowhere else. The system ran on expertise that had never been captured, which meant it ran on the continued presence of the people who held it. That was not a system. That was a liability. On her second Tuesday, she began a tour of all operational areas she hadn't yet visited. The receiving dock was her 3rd stop. She walked through the door at 6:47 in the morning, and the first thing she saw was Neil Chambers asleep at his desk with the granola bar and the cold coffee, and a screen full of logistics tracking windows that nobody watching from the doorway would have known how to read. She saw a man sleeping on the job. She did not see the screen. The floor supervisor, a quiet man named Robbie who had worked alongside Neil for 7 years, watched her call for the termination and said nothing. Not because he agreed, but because he had a mortgage and a family in Red Deer he sent money to every month, and the calculus of speaking up against a new director on her second week was not a calculus that landed in favor of speaking up. Neil was awake enough by the time HR arrived to understand what was happening. He tried once. He told Carolyn that she needed to know about the cold chain routing before anyone touched the overnight queue. She told him that HR would handle the exit paperwork and that she didn't receive operational briefings from terminated employees. He looked at her for a moment, not with anger, with the specific focus of a person trying to communicate something urgent to someone who has already decided not to receive it. He said, "Don't manually override the temperature zone flags in the batch marked TZ North. They're not errors. They're compensating for the sensor lag in the Sioux Lookout relay." Carolyn had already turned back to the floor supervisor to ask about the rest of the morning's schedule. Neil left the building at 7:15. He had not been given a chance to send a single message or leave a note for any of the other logistics staff. He drove home. Eli was already at school. The apartment was quiet in the way apartments are quiet when the specific small energy of a child has recently left them. Neil sat at the kitchen table for a while without taking off his jacket. Then he lay down on the sofa, and his body, which had been waiting for this with something close to desperation, pulled him under almost immediately. Back at the facility, the morning continued without visible disruption. The outgoing shipments for the early window processed smoothly. Carolyn sat with the operations manager and talked about documentation protocols. She felt, not without some justification based on what she could observe, that the organization was more functional than the parent company had suggested. The issue did not announce itself. That was the nature of it. Neil had identified the problem 3 days earlier during a routine audit of the cold chain batch processing logs. The Sioux Lookout Relay Station, a midpoint in the Northern Delivery Network that handled pharmaceutical redistribution for several remote nursing stations, had begun producing temperature zone flags that the central system was interpreting as sensor errors. The flags were not errors. The relay station had undergone a partial equipment update 6 weeks prior, and the new sensors reported in a slightly different format than the old ones, a format the central system had not been updated to parse correctly. What this meant in practical terms was that the system's automatic response to these flags was to prepare a temperature compensation override for the next processing batch. If that override was applied, it would reduce the cold chain holding parameters for insulin and certain biologics by enough that the products would still pass automated quality checks, but would exit the verified safe storage window over the course of a long northern delivery. By the time the shipment reached its endpoint, the product would be technically delivered and functionally compromised. Neil had caught it by accident, the way people with deep familiarity catch things that automated systems miss entirely. He had been looking at something else, and the pattern had registered at the edge of his attention and refused to leave. He had traced it back through the logs, understood what it was, and immediately begun constructing a manual flag override that would neutralize the automatic compensation and hold the correct temperature parameters until the system could be properly patched. He had reported it to his direct supervisor, a man named Gary who was under significant pressure from the parent company transition and who had asked Neil to document it in the new ticketing system and flag it for the software team. The ticketing system had been live for 3 weeks, and the software team's response queue was running at 4 to 6 business days. Neil had filed the ticket and continued building the manual fix anyway because the batch was processing in 48 hours and he did not have 4 to 6 business days. The fix he built was not elegant. It was the logistics equivalent of propping a door open with a carefully placed wedge and hoping nobody moved the wedge. It required someone to monitor the TZ North flags manually during processing and to not, under any circumstances, apply the system's recommended override because the system's recommendation was wrong. He had been monitoring it for 2 days. He had not slept in any meaningful sense during those 2 days. He had eaten from the vending machine in the break room and changed his shirt once, and kept watching the flags because nobody else knew what they were watching for. He had planned to hand it off in person to someone he trusted, walk them through exactly what to look for and what not to touch. That was the plan he had when he put his head down for one moment in the gray early morning of a Tuesday, with the overnight shift still running and the morning crew 40 minutes from arriving. Carolyn's arrival had interrupted a handoff that never happened. The processing batch ran at 11 in the morning. The TZ North flags appeared at 11:42. The logistics technician on duty had not been briefed. She saw flags, saw the system's recommended override, and did what the system told her was the appropriate action. She applied the temperature compensation. At 1 in the afternoon, the operations manager noticed that a subset of the northern shipments had logged unusual temperature parameters. He pulled the batch records and found what looked like a configuration anomaly. He spent 40 minutes attempting to trace it through the new ticketing system, found Neil's ticket, found that it was marked as pending and unresolved, and began to understand the shape of the problem without yet understanding its full dimension. He called Gary. Gary called the software team. The software team confirmed that the relay sensor format mismatch was a known issue they had been planning to patch. Planning to patch was not the same as having patched it. By 2 o'clock, there were 4 people in the operations manager's office, trying to determine whether the affected shipment could be intercepted before it reached the distribution point at Sioux Lookout, from which it would be broken into smaller deliveries bound for the nursing stations. The answer was that it could be intercepted if they could reach the courier contractor before the redistribution, and the courier contractor was a small independent operation that ran a limited radio window. Carolyn was called out of a budget meeting at 2:15. She walked into the operations room and found it transformed in the way that rooms transform when the people inside them have stopped moving at a normal pace. Robbie was on the phone. The operations manager had 3 windows open on his screen and was typing into all of them. 2 logistics technicians were cross-referencing paper manifests with the digital tracking system. Carolyn asked what was happening. The operations manager turned from his screen. He was a careful man who chose words deliberately, and the words he chose were, "We have a cold chain integrity issue in the TZ North batch. We think the temperature parameters were compromised about 2 hours ago. If the shipment redistributes before we can intercept it, we're looking at compromised product reaching at least 3 nursing stations." Carolyn understood immediately what compromised product meant in this context. She asked what had caused it. Robbie put down the phone and answered before the operations manager could. He said Neil flagged it 3 days ago. He built a manual workaround. He told you not to touch the TZ North flags when they terminated him this morning. He said exactly that. The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms do when something has been said that changes the meaning of everything that preceded it. Carolyn remembered the moment. She remembered turning away. She had processed it as the parting commentary of a man who felt his expertise was being dismissed along with his employment. She asked where Neil's documentation was. The operations manager pulled up the ticket. He pulled up the manual log notes Neil had saved in a shared folder that, because it predated the new system, had not been migrated and was therefore invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. The notes were written in the compressed, practical shorthand of someone working fast under pressure. They described the problem, the workaround, and the specific instruction not to apply the system override for TZ North, written in plain language and underlined. Carolyn read it standing up at someone else's workstation. She read the timestamp on the original ticket. She read the note about the sensor format mismatch. She read the underlined warning. Then she asked for Neil Chambers' personal contact information. His phone rang 4 times before he answered. His voice had the particular texture of someone surfacing from a very deep sleep, cautious, not yet fully located. She told him who she was. She told him what had happened. She did not soften the sequence of events or reframe them in organizational language. She said, "I terminated you this morning before you could finish what you were trying to tell me. The batch has been compromised. We're trying to intercept the shipment and we don't fully understand your workaround notes. I'm sorry, and I need your help." There was a silence that lasted long enough that she wondered if he had gone back to sleep. He hadn't. He was sitting up on the sofa in his quiet apartment, processing the information with the same attention he brought to a logistics flag that didn't pattern correctly. The specifics landed where the specifics needed to land, and he organized them quickly. He asked 3 questions. Which courier? What time the redistribution was scheduled? Whether anyone had already attempted to patch the sensor format issue or only documented it. She answered all 3. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I'll call the courier directly. I have his cell number. Don't let anyone touch the system configuration until I've walked someone through what needs to happen. Is Robbie still there?" She said yes. "Good," he said. "Put him on." What followed was 22 minutes on the phone with Robbie, during which Neil walked him through the exact sequence of steps needed to hold the batch in place, reach the courier contractor, and establish a temperature re-verification protocol that would catch any product that had already crossed out of the safe window. Robbie had worked alongside Neil long enough to understand the shorthand. He asked the right questions. Neil answered them without impatience. The courier, a man named Pete who ran a 2-truck operation out of a property south of Sioux Lookout, and who had Neil's number in his phone from 3 years of working the same route, picked up on the second ring. He had not yet completed the redistribution. Neil asked him to hold the batch and call back with a temperature reading from the storage unit. Pete read the number. Neil did the math in his head against the parameters he had been watching for 2 days and told Pete which units were still within range and which needed to be pulled. 2 of the 7 sub-batches were compromised. 5 were recoverable. The 2 that were pulled would need to be replaced. Neil, still on the phone, told the operations manager which backup inventory line held product within the same cold chain window and gave him the bin location from memory. By 4:30, the replacement shipment was in transit. The 5 recoverable units were back on schedule. The 2 nursing stations that would have received compromised insulin received verified product instead, approximately 6 hours late, with a courier note that said delay due to quality verification. Nobody at those stations knew how close it had been. Carolyn drove to Neil's apartment herself. She had the address from HR and she sat in her car outside for a moment before going up, not to compose herself but because the gap between where she had stood at 6:47 that morning and where she was standing now was not a gap that could be crossed quickly or without acknowledgement. She knocked. She heard movement inside, then a child's voice, and then Neil's voice low and close to the door. He opened it wearing a different shirt than the one he'd been terminated in. He looked at her with the particular steadiness of someone who had expected she might come and had not decided yet what to do about it. Behind him at the kitchen table, a boy with dark hair sat doing homework with a pencil moving in careful deliberate strokes across the page. The boy looked up briefly, assessed the situation with the calm of a child who had learned to read unfamiliar adults, and returned to his work. Carolyn said, "I owe you a direct apology, not a process apology or an organizational acknowledgement, a direct one. I dismissed what you were trying to tell me, and I did it before I heard it, and if Pete hadn't been reachable and if Robbie hadn't understood your notes, this would have ended differently, and the ending would have had real consequences for people with no part in this." Neil listened to the whole thing without interrupting. He did not perform a reaction. She asked if she could come in and talk through what came next. He looked back at his son for a moment, not checking, just orienting, then stepped aside. They sat in the small living room with mugs of tea Neil made without asking whether she wanted one. Eli continued his homework at the table with the focused persistence of a child who has learned not to require adult attention for the duration. Carolyn offered reinstatement without modification to his terms. She told him the parent company's HR team would be contacted in the morning and that the termination would be removed from his file entirely. She told him she planned to personally commission a full audit of the logistics knowledge that existed in heads and nowhere else, with the intention of documenting and distributing it in a format that meant no single person was ever again the only barrier between a broken process and a compromised outcome. Neil listened to all of it. Then he said, "There are 3 other things I want." She said, "Tell me." The first was a direct escalation channel for safety-critical logistics issues that bypassed middle management, not a ticketing system with a 4 to 6 day queue. A person with authority reachable within 2 hours. The second was a structured overlap protocol for any role dealing with cold chain logistics, so that coverage during extended operational situations was built into the schedule rather than absorbed personally by whoever happened to know the most. The third was a formal written commitment that employees who flagged genuine safety issues would not face professional consequences for escalating above their direct supervisors when those supervisors declined to act. Carolyn sat with these for a moment. She was not running the calculus of what was feasible within the current parent company structure. She was registering that the man across from her, who had every reason to ask for money or a title or a corner in the new organizational chart, had instead spent his leverage on policies that would protect the next person in his position. She said, "All 3, and I'm adding a 4th. The manual log system you built in the old shared folder becomes the template for the knowledge documentation protocol. Your format, your structure. You'll lead that project." Neil considered this with the same attention he gave a logistics flag that was trying to tell him something. Then he gave a single nod. He was back on site the next morning. The adjustment was not formal or performed. He walked back in, said hello to Robbie, who said nothing but whose expression communicated something substantial, sat at his usual station and started where he had left off. Carolyn had spent the evening on 2 calls. One with the parent company explaining what had occurred, and one with the software team confirming that the sensor format patch would be deployed within 48 hours. On the second call, she noted that a ticket flagging this exact issue had been sitting in the queue for 3 days, and asked what the process was for escalating safety-critical items in the system. When the answer she received was that the current process did not distinguish between categories of urgency, she said that was going to change. The cold chain audit took 6 weeks. Neil ran it methodically, the way he ran everything. He interviewed 17 staff members, cross-referenced their institutional knowledge against the existing documentation, and produced a reference document that captured not just the official processes but the real ones, the workarounds that had been built to compensate for the system's known limitations, the indicators that experienced eyes watched for that no formal checklist had ever recorded, the judgment calls that happened daily and had never been named. The document was 83 pages. The operations manager read it twice and kept a printed copy at his desk. The parent company used it as the template for a regional knowledge documentation initiative that eventually covered 5 other distribution centers. At a staff meeting 6 weeks after the crisis, Carolyn said in front of the full team that the events of that Tuesday had been a failure of leadership and not of the people working under it. She said she had made a decision that morning based on what something looked like rather than what it was, and that the gap between those two things had nearly resulted in harm to people the organization existed to serve. She said she had learned something she should have arrived already knowing, and that the cost of learning it had been paid mostly by someone else. Neil, sitting at the far end of the table, did not respond visibly to any of this. He had not processed the situation as something requiring closure, because closure implied that the central thing had been the injustice rather than the work. The work was what mattered to him. The work had been resolved. The rest was just the particular shape that resolution had taken. Several months later, on an evening in early November, when the temperature had dropped far enough that the city looked scraped clean, Neil picked Eli up from the after-school program and walked home through air that tasted like winter coming in earnest. Eli had a project under his arm, a hand-drawn diagram of the water cycle with his own annotations in careful block letters. He explained it during the walk with the serious thoroughness of a child who is prepared for this explanation. Neil listened to the whole thing. The particular pride he felt was not the performed pride that adults sometimes show children. It was the real kind, uncomplicated and specific, the kind that comes from watching someone you love become more fully themselves. They stopped at the grocery store. Eli selected a box of crackers with the gravity of a person making a meaningful choice. Neil paid and they walked the last 2 blocks home in the particular comfortable silence of people who know each other well enough not to need to fill it. The apartment was warm. Eli set his project on the kitchen table and went to find his book. Neil put the kettle on and stood at the window for a moment looking at the city in the late light. He thought briefly about Pete picking up the phone on the second ring, about Robbie who had understood the shorthand, about the nursing station somewhere north of Sioux Lookout, where a supply that arrived late had arrived right. He did not think about it as a crisis averted. He thought about it as a job, one that had required everything he had and then required him to finish it from his sofa in a city far from the system he had spent 2 days keeping alive. The kind of job where the stakes were real and the people most affected never knew your name. The kettle clicked off. He made 2 mugs, brought one to the kitchen table, and set it beside Eli's homework without saying anything. Eli reached for it without looking up from his book, the gesture automatic and easy, the movement of a child who does not think about whether the people who love him will still be there when he reaches. They were still there. That was the whole of it, and it was enough.